I see it, you see it, we all see it. There's a shift happening that a lot of people can feel, but don't quite have the language for. You notice it in conversations, in attraction, in the kinds of dynamics people are drawn to now compared to even 10 or 15 years ago. More men are openly or quietly gravitating toward female led dynamics. And what's interesting is that this isn't happening in loud, dramatic ways how big changes usually go. It's actually very subtle. It's thoughtful. It often shows up as relief rather than excitement. And that alone tells us something important. Because real social shifts don't announce themselves, they settle in slowly until one day you realize the old way of doing things no longer fits. When people talk about leadership in relationships, they often default to tradition, to what used to be normal. But what we call tradition was, for a very long time, less about preference and more about necessity. Male led dynamics dominated because society was built around pure survival. It's as simple as that. Physical labor, rigid hierarchies, limited resources. Men were expected to lead not because they were always suited for it, but because someone just had to. Leadership was assigned to men, not chosen. And when roles are assigned, people adapt, whether or not it aligns with who they actually are. So, what's changed isn't men, it's the environment. Luckily, most of us no longer live in a world where survival depends on physical dominance or emotional suppression. Most people are not fighting for land, food, or protection on a daily basis. Instead, we live in a world that demands adaptability, flexibility, communication, emotional regulation, and psychological awareness. Those are not female traits, but they are traits that women were historically encouraged or even forced to develop. And now that those traits matter more than ever, the balance naturally shifts. This is why female led dynamics feel less like a rebellion and more like a simple adaptation. They emerge where competence, clarity, and emotional intelligence are valued, where leadership isn't about imposing one's will, but about setting direction, where authority feels stabilizing instead of oppressive. For many men, especially thoughtful and introspective ones, that kind of leadership feels very grounding, not emasculating, just grounding. Another thing that rarely gets said out loud is how actually exhausting modern masculinity can be. Not masculinity itself, but the performance of it. The expectation to always know, to always decide, to always be certain, to carry pressure silently. For generations, men were taught that leadership meant emotional isolation, that vulnerability undermined authority, that asking for support was failure. And yet, the modern world punishes emotional illiteracy. So, men are caught in a contradiction, expected to lead without being given the tools to do so in a healthy way. Female led dynamics quietly resolve that tension. They offer a clear structure without emotional deprivation, direction without detachment, authority without coldness. That combination is rare and deeply attractive. It's also important to understand that this shift couldn't have happened earlier. Female led dynamics require choice. They require women who are economically independent, socially active, and psychologically literate. And they require men who are allowed to explore their inner worlds without immediate judgment. In other words, this isn't a trend born of novelty. It's a byproduct of modern conditions. Once people have the freedom to choose roles instead of inheriting them, they start choosing based on what fits them rather than what is expected of them. There's also something happening beneath the surface that many people miss. As our society becomes more complex, leadership itself is changing. The old model of leadership, aka command, dominance, emotional distance, is less effective in environments that require collaboration, nuance, and adaptability. In contrast, leadership styles that emphasize awareness, responsiveness, and emotional intelligence are proving more effective across all sorts of industries, communities, and relationships. And when people experience that kind of leadership in the world, it's only natural that they begin to seek it in their personal lives too. This is why framing female led dynamics as men giving up power completely misses the point. Power isn't disappearing at all, it's being reorganized. What's fading is forced leadership, and what's emerging is intentional leadership. And intentional leadership doesn't belong to one gender. For men who are service oriented, observant, emotionally perceptive, or internally driven, female led dynamics often feel like permission to stop performing and start relating. Not because they're incapable, but because they're self aware. They don't want chaos disguised as freedom. They want structure that allows depth. It's also worth noting that resistance to this shift often comes from fear, not reason. When identity is built entirely around being the leader, any alternative feels very threatening. But evolution doesn't erase leadership, it diversifies it. Female led dynamics don't invalidate male leadership at all. They simply offer another configuration, one that fits the psychological realities of our modern life. What we are really seeing is a movement away from survival based hierarchies and toward psychological compatibility instead. People are no longer asking, what am I supposed to be? They're asking, what actually works for me? And when people ask that question honestly, female led dynamics often make sense, not ideologically, but emotionally. Submission in this context is being redefined, not as weakness, not as failure, but as a conscious placement of trust in someone else's hands. Chosen submission is not about disappearing. So, if you've noticed a shift in yourself, in others, or in the broader culture, it's not your imagination. Something has indeed changed. Not because men are less capable than before, not because women are taking over, but because the world no longer demands rigid rules to function. It's as simple as that, really. And when pressure eases, preference emerges. Female led dynamics are becoming more common not because they're fashionable, but because they reflect the psychological needs of this moment in time. And that's worth paying attention to. Now, my boys, as usual, before I let you go, I need to remind you, because you're bad boys, that you need to hit that subscribe button and the bell so you get notified every single time I post. Hit the like, leave a comment, share this video, and as always, you'll find all my links in the description. I'll see you next time. Bye.